Hello, anatomy students. This is the notes package on the endocrine system, and I'll be moving through about the first 6 or 7 pages of the notes package, and I may be going a little faster than usual because I don't have any lovely faces to look at, but feel free to slow it down as required or speed it up. And your goal is just to fill in basically one lecture's worth of notes, so that when I see you next, we can pick up where we left off and you're not behind because of the long weekend. So the endocrine system, of course, consists of a number of endocrine glands. And we talked about glands previously. These are glands that are ductless. They have no ducts, and they release chemicals called hormones into the blood. These are different, of course, from exocrine glands, which release substances through ducts into body cavities or onto the body surface. The endocrine system works very closely with the nervous system to regulate homeostasis. Its functions include maintaining homeostasis through negative feedback regulation. Homeostasis, we discussed at the very beginning of 152, is a steady state in the body, and there's always fluctuations around that steady state, but the values will return to some set point level that represents normal. The endocrine system is also very important in regulating growth and metabolism. And the endocrine system, as I mentioned, works very closely with the nervous system. The nervous system regulates the endocrine system both directly and indirectly through the release of its own system of hormones. This diagram represents all of the endocrine glands that we'll be studying. I will be going through the endocrine glands, and you can label the diagram as we go through, but I'm going to give you a chance to think about what each of these endocrine glands is before you actually write it down. Number 1 is an endocrine gland that you studied when we looked at the brain. It's an endocrine gland that is responsible for regulating sleep-wake cycles. This endocrine gland is the pineal gland. Labels 2 and 3 represent an endocrine gland that sits on the floor of the cranial cavity in the sella turcica. And this endocrine gland, of course, is called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the so-called master endocrine gland. It releases many hormones that regulate the activity of other endocrine glands. There are 2 components to the pituitary. Number 2 represents the posterior pituitary, also known as the neurohypophysis. This part of the pituitary is actually made of neural tissue. Number 3 is the anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis. This part of the pituitary is glandular, so it's made of epithelial tissue. Number 4 is a gland located over the larynx in the neck, and this gland is the thyroid gland. Number 6 is a gland we've also discussed previously. It's a gland that lies in the mediastinum. It's very large in adults, or very large in infants, and atrophies in adults. This gland is the thymus gland. Whoops. Sorry. So we have the parathyroid gland. Parathyroid glands are a small cluster of glands on the back of the thyroid. So if you were to pull the thyroid gland off and look underneath on the posterior surface embedded in the thyroid gland, you would see a number of small glands called the parathyroid glands. So back to number 6, hopefully you got that one. That was the thymus gland. So number 7 is the gland that sits on top of the kidneys, and this gland also has 2 components to it. And this is the adrenal gland, and number 7, the outer part of the adrenal gland, is known as the adrenal cortex. Deep to the adrenal gland is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla secrete different hormones. Number 9. This is both an endocrine and exocrine gland. It functions as an exocrine gland to release an assortment of digestive enzymes. As an endocrine gland, it releases the hormone insulin and the hormone glucagon. This is, of course, the pancreas. So our character here appears to have both male and female gonads. 10, of course, is indicating the female gonads, and that is the ovaries. And 11 is indicating the testes. So a number of these endocrine glands, as you can see, belong in more than one system. So the ovaries and testes are part of the reproductive system, but they are also endocrine glands, so they are considered to be part of the endocrine system. Similarly with the pancreas is part of the digestive system, but it releases hormones, so it is also an endocrine gland. So the endocrine and nervous system work very closely together to regulate homeostasis. They differ, however, in fairly fundamental ways. The endocrine system, of course, has as its chemical messenger hormones, whereas the nervous system uses neurotransmitters as chemical messengers. The site of action for the nervous system is the synapse. It's very localized, whereas the site of action for the endocrine system is the circulatory system. Endocrine hormones, of course, are released into the blood, so they are very widespread in their distribution and they circulate to all the tissues of the body. The nature of the response refers to the speed with which these systems can bring about effects. And in the case of the nervous system, the effects are very rapid and short-term. Neurotransmitters are released into synapses. They have effects on effectors, but they are short-lived effects. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is a system that has very slow and long-term effects. Hormones are released into the blood, where they circulate for hours or days or minutes, depending on the hormone. So there's a number of stimuli that will trigger endocrine glands to release their hormones, and I think many of these are quite predictable. This visual just compares the nervous system to the endocrine system, and just reminding you of the site at which neurotransmitters elicit their effects, the synapse, and in the case of hormones, they're widely distributed in circulation and have effects all over the body. So stimulation of endocrine glands, predictably, can occur in response to the nervous system. The ANS has as its target cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, and among those glands, of course, are endocrine glands. So the ANS can stimulate endocrine glands to release hormones. There are also some endocrine glands that release their hormones in response to what are called humoral stimuli. And these are basically chemicals in the blood. For example, the presence of glucose in the blood will stimulate the pancreas to release the hormone insulin. The third mechanism of stimulation is hormones. In particular, pituitary hormones. The pituitary releases a number of hormones that target endocrine glands and stimulate those endocrine glands to release their hormones. And that's why the pituitary is known as the master endocrine gland. When these hormones are released, they are released into the blood. And in the case of hormones which are water-soluble, they will circulate freely. In the case of hormones which are water insoluble, lipid or steroid hormones, they will be transported on carrier proteins. These hormones will circulate in the blood, and when they reach their target cells, they will bind to receptors and bring about some kind of response. Not all cells have receptors for all hormones, so the target cells will be those cells that have receptors for a particular hormone. So the concentration of hormones can be measured in the blood, and I'm sure some of you have probably had hormone levels measured. And the concentration that you measure of any particular hormone at any particular moment in time will reflect how much of the hormone is being released, but also how quickly the hormone is being removed or inactivated. We can estimate the hormone half-life for any of the hormones that are released into the blood. And this is basically the time it takes for half of the circulating hormone to be eliminated. And most hormones, the half-life would be less than 1 minute and up to an hour, but it's highly variable. Hormone inactivation can occur by a number of mechanisms. The hormone can bind to a receptor in the target cell, and it may actually be taken up by the target cell or enter the target cell by crossing the phospholipid bilayer, and then it will be potentially removed from circulation. Many hormones are metabolized by the liver, and the metabolic products or the hormones themselves are excreted by the kidneys. And hormones may also be broken down by enzymes which circulate in blood or tissue fluid. So hormone structure can be subdivided into 3 general categories: lipid hormones, peptide hormones, and amino acids. So the lipid hormones are classified as steroid hormones, and they're derived from this molecule, which is cholesterol. The peptide hormones are short chains of amino acids, and one of them is shown here, and these hormones are among the most common group of hormones, the peptide hormones. And then modified amino acids, one amino acid is shown here, represent the 3rd structural category of hormones. So we'll look at the lipid hormones first. Many of these I think are familiar hormones, and many of them are involved in regulating reproduction. So these are the so-called steroid hormones, and as I mentioned, they're derived from cholesterol. And these steroid hormones include progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, calcitriol, and aldosterone. Now, some of these hormones you haven't heard of before, but you'll notice they all have a similar structure. The second category of lipid hormones are known as the eicosanoids. And this is a special family of hormones. We're not going to talk too much about them, but they are derived from a fatty acid known as arachidonate. And this fatty acid gives rise to chemicals such as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. These chemicals are associated with the inflammatory process, and we'll talk a little more about inflammation in Biology 153. This group of hormones are a little bit unusual. They are what are known as paracrine hormones, which means that they have effects only in the area immediately close to where they are released. So these are typically chemicals that are released by cells, and these cellular chemicals affect nearby cells. So this little image, and I've put Part of this image in your notes there just illustrates the difference between paracrine and endocrine. Autocrine is a term we mentioned before. Autocrine is where a cell releases chemicals that actually regulate itself. Paracrine is where a cell releases chemicals such as paracrine hormones, eicosanoids, that will have an effect on nearby cells. So here we have a cell releasing chemicals and binding to receptors on a nearby cell. Endocrine hormones, of course, are hormones that are released into circulation, and they will travel to target tissues where they will interact with target cells. So peptide hormones is a very large family of hormones, and these are basically small chains of amino acids or very small proteins, and sometimes glycosylated proteins or glycoproteins. The picture shown here is of growth hormone, a pituitary hormone that, of course, regulates growth. Most hormones, as I mentioned, fall into this family. Here we have growth hormone, GH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and antidiuretic hormone. So as we study these hormones, I will be using the abbreviations, and you're welcome to use the abbreviations as well, but on exams you should be expected to know what those abbreviations stand for and to be able to write out the entire name of the hormone. Amino acid hormones are small molecules known as monoamines. These include some chemicals we've talked about already as neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine and dopamine, for example, are both examples of amino acid hormones, which behave as hormones only when they're released into the blood. So these chemicals are quite unusual. They can behave as neurotransmitters when they're released into the synapse and as hormones in the blood. Melatonin and thyroid hormone are also examples of amino acid hormones. So hormones are released into the blood. They circulate to target tissues, and when they reach a target tissue that has a receptor for that hormone, they will interact with these receptors. And hormone receptors fall into two basic categories. There are the membrane-bound receptors, which sit on the surface of the cells. So these are located in the cell membrane. These kinds of receptors bind hydrophilic hormones. So these are the receptors that interact with water-soluble hormones that circulate freely in the blood. Most peptide hormones and amino acid hormones would work through membrane-bound receptors. The second category, you have a little picture here, I guess, to label. It's at the just underneath this section in the middle of the page. So here you can see a phospholipid bilayer, of course. We're going to label the ECF and the ICF there just for context. And phospholipid bilayer, just in case you forgot what that looks like. And the hormone. So the hormone is shown interacting with its receptor. And it interacts at a very specific binding site. So the second category of hormone receptors are actually inside the cell cytoplasm, or somewhere, for example, inside the nucleus of a cell. So these are known as the intracellular receptors within the cell. And you have a little image here of these to label. Phospholipid bilayer is shown there. The hormone circulates in the blood, and these are typically lipid-soluble hormones. The hormones get inside the cell, crossing the phospholipid bilayer to bind to hormone receptors that are in the cytoplasm or associated with some organelle inside the cell. So these receptors are located in the cell cytoplasm or the cell nucleus. And these hormones are typically hydrophobic. That is, they are hormones that can pass through the phospholipid bilayer. For example, the steroid hormones. Thyroid hormone is a bit of a tricky hormone. We'll be talking a little bit more about thyroid hormone. It's not a steroid hormone, but it does bind to an intracellular receptor. So when we studied neurotransmitters, we talked about the mechanism of action of neurotransmitters. That is how the binding of a neurotransmitter to a receptor brings about some kind of effect. So we can also talk about the mechanisms of action of hormones, and they're very similar in their effects. We'll look first at the peptide or monoamine hormones. So these are the hydrophilic or water-soluble hormones that are transported freely in the blood. These hormones bind to receptors on the membrane of the target cell, so at the surface of the target cell, and they typically work by activating a second messenger via a G protein. So just to remind you, binding of the hormone to the receptor would activate a G protein, which would in turn activate a second messenger inside the cell. Steroid hormones are not water-soluble, and when they travel in the blood, they need to be carried on a water-soluble transport protein. So steroid hormones are typically associated with transport proteins. These hormones, however, can diffuse freely into the target cell. Once they're inside the cell, they will bind to intracellular receptors, and this will result in the activation of enzymes or genes. The bottom line is either mechanism of action can lead to the opening or closing of ion channels, turning on or turning off transporters in the cell, can stimulate protein synthesis, activate or inactivate enzymes, induce secretion, and even stimulate cell division. So the effects are many depending on the hormone. And I think you'll discover as we go through and talk about hormones that a lot of the mechanisms we're talking about, in fact, are quite similar to the mechanisms that were discussed when we talked about neurotransmitters. So we're going to look at these mechanisms of action just in a visual way in a little bit more detail. So the water-soluble hormones, here's your little visual here, of course, circulate in the blood. This particular image shows two hormones circulating in the blood, this triangular shaped one and this little one that looks like three little balls together, and they will interact with different receptors. This would be a target cell for these hormones, and this, of course, is going to represent a G protein. So these hormones diffuse out of the blood and bind to receptors that are located in the cell membrane. So these hormones are in the blood, and they bind to cell membrane receptors. The receptors are shown in green. These receptors will interact with a G protein. And if you recall, interaction with the G protein activates a second messenger. Now, we've talked about one second messenger system with respect to neurotransmitters. That is a second messenger system involving cyclic AMP. I'm going to mention a different second messenger system, which is also fairly common in cells. But we'll look at the first one here. The second messengers are shown inside the cell. And cyclic AMP is a common second messenger. The other one is one known as inositol triphosphate, or IP3. So this is mentioned mainly so you understand that there are different kinds of second messengers that can be activated by G proteins. The bottom line is, typically with activation of cyclic AMP, you alter chemical reactions or open ion channels through some mechanism or other. IP3 is important in activating the release of calcium. And calcium release into the cell cytoplasm binds to a protein called calmodulin, and this in turn activates enzymes that have an assortment of effects. The bottom line is the hormone interacts with the receptor at the cell surface, and through interaction with the G protein will bring about some sort of change inside the target cell. So lipid-soluble hormones circulate in the blood, but because they're not water-soluble, they are bound to transport proteins. So they're going to be associated with some kind of transport protein. Sorry about the... Okay. See if that gets rid of that little message there. So here we have the hormone shown in blue and the transport protein shown in black. And then the hormone can diffuse out of the blood across the capillary walls and then across the phospholipid bilayer of all cells. So lipid-soluble hormones can typically cross freely into cells all over the body, but these hormones will only exert effects on the cells that have intracellular receptors for that hormone. In this case, the intracellular receptor shown is inside the nucleus, and this is a common scenario. And the hormone, through interaction with its receptor in the nucleus, can alter gene transcription. And of course, this means altering the kinds of proteins that are produced. And these proteins could be ion channels, they could be other enzymes that activate chemical reactions, they could be receptors, they could be structural proteins, they could be regulatory proteins, and so on. So pretty much any of the molecular tools that proteins represent could be synthesized as a result of this kind of interaction. So steroid hormones, of course, work this way. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I think that's a good introduction to the endocrine system. That takes you up to the first 6 pages in the notes, and hopefully that didn't take up too much of your long weekend to do. Thanks for listening.